This chapter is about open borders and the strain they put on the fabric of this nation. But I thought I'd interrupt this train of thought and discuss a couple of responses we've seen over the past few years regarding the influx of these illegals through the southern border. No, I'm not going to talk about the razor wire or the Supreme Court decision related to all of that. But when Governor DeSantis first decided to send migrants to Martha's Vineyard in 2022, people were decrying this as a political stunt. Of course it was. This idea of sending illegals to places that had declared themselves sanctuary cities was brilliant. Martha's Vineyard, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, Wilmington, Delaware. These are all places that declared themselves sanctuary cities out of some position of virtue. They would never turn their backs on the needy, on the hungry, on the homeless. They would never turn away from the children and families looking for a better life. And come on, it was easy to pledge their willingness to disregard the law in favor of this virtuous, supposed caring for our neighbor attitude because, let's face it, they never believed anyone would truly test it. I mean, maybe one or two illegals would find their way to Martha's Vineyard or Wilmington, Delaware. Maybe the illegals would trickle into Chicago and New York City and Washington, D.C., but these cities were not close by. They weren't close to this border. It's not like they would ever arrive en masse to put an unexpected pressure on the resources, on the infrastructure of the city, and on the hospitality of these self-declared very virtuous sanctuary cities. Plus, it was the local governments making the declaration that they would not enforce immigration law. And in the previous episode, we just discussed how when governments are willing to disregard one law or apply one law unequally, how quickly the rule of law in general can break down. And that's exactly what New York City and Chicago and these cities are seeing happening now. Anyway, the first response when New York City realized they had no plan to actually be a sanctuary city, no resources to support a large influx of illegals with nowhere to live, no jobs, Mayor Adams simply called for, actually demanded, what he did, his first response was, we need more resources. This is like the federal government needs to send us more money. DC needs to step up and do their job. But in my opinion, the first response should have been for these cities to realize the kind of pressure that those other cities that are actually near the border have been placed under, not just recently, but for years, without any additional and growing resources for these undesired elements within their cities. And then these sanctuary cities should have acknowledged that if such a situation is untenable for New York City, it's got to be untenable for these Texas and California and Arizona communities too. And then these so-called virtuous governments should have, instead of demanding more resources, more money, they should have demanded Biden do everything to close the border, everything within his power to close the border. But that is not what happened. And in Chicago, we watch as the inner city communities, who are always promised so much by their governments, were bypassed as additional resources were not just provided for these new and unexpected communities of illegals, but resources intended for their urban communities were diverted to non-citizens. So the pain that these communities are experiencing might wake a few more up to the damage our governments, local and national, this damage that they've been inflicting on this nation, maybe just when it comes to open borders, but maybe also in other areas. I don't know, because I'm not really holding my breath, because everyone is still discussing resources. Not that this is unimportant. I mean, why are we sending money to Ukraine to protect its border, but we won't do anything to secure ours? Why are we handing out money to criminals from foreign nations while we have an income and housing and drug crisis among US born citizens? And so maybe we should be focused on how this is actually dividing our country, but instead we're still focused on the resources. And really, when we talk about this, it doesn't even touch on the resources diverted for educating the children of illegals or dealing with the health problems of illegals and the diseases they bring with them to pass on to everyone else. The added stress of feeding and housing illegals is just the beginning. There is also a stress on the criminal justice system that we're seeing, but also the medical system, the education system, the infrastructure, and the economy. And these are stresses that many small towns are not prepared for, and they know it. And they never declared themselves sanctuary cities. I mean, we see Governor Hochul in New York trying to take the burden off New York City and send illegals to small conservative towns in upstate New York. And now these small towns are scrambling to make all of her attempts to do this impossible through municipal and county policy. There's an actual kind of legislative and political war going on in places like New York State. And I could dive much deeper into that, but at this point, I've taken up too much time, but I thought I would introduce some additional issues to think about before moving back to my rather dated argument now about how de facto open border policy is destroying the fabric of our country. Remember, de facto open border policy is an attack on shared language, with one of the pillars of holding up society, but it's also an attack on pillar 2, that of shared values, as they are bringing their values, the very attitudes and values that put them in an undesirable position in their own countries, and they're bringing those attitudes and values into this country. De facto open border policy, especially when coupled with the idea that it is in direct contradiction to actual law, undermines American law and order, which in turn, again, undermines shared values. Again, by dismissing equality and liberty as rights and the natural order to be protected by our government. But as border security fails and is actually called good, this serves to distort values at home, right, among American citizens, but it also serves to extinguish the hopes of the very people looking for hope in this new place that they're going. Now we're on page 92. Lastly, advocating for and implementing de facto open border policies instills a feeling of virtue in the masses, redefining the value system for the altruistic, good-hearted American. And this is actually the most damaging of all the goals accomplished by open borders, because the prevailing narrative has been defined to frame natural law as unjust. And in this case, proponents of open borders have convinced Americans to view the tares as wheat. If you don't understand that reference, go back to chapter 7. But here it is. If someone disagrees with open borders, they are labeled a racist, not someone concerned with security and safety. If someone disagrees with open borders, they are accused of turning their back on the very foundation of this country, as we are a country of immigrants. If someone disagrees with open borders, they don't believe in pursuit of happiness or a better life or liberty for anyone but themselves and their nationalist compatriots. Forget the propping up of dictators in the countries they are leaving, where those who remain behind are subject to the kinds of conditions that could be remedied were the dictator thrown out. Forget the ruined and lost lives of the children being trafficked, the loss of dreams for the adults now enslaved, the damage done to the laws and lives of the American-born who have been enslaved themselves by gangs and drugs, who have also had their dreams shattered and destroyed, who have ended up in prison and who are exploited to keep the cycle churning out for the next generation. I often hear from the average American conservative that the reason government officials don't worry too much about the border and refuse to call the surge of undocumented individuals crossing unrestricted a crisis is because they are hoping to capitalize on the new votes for their party that they are allowing to enter, which will lead to winning elections and gaining more power. And this might be a convincing argument, especially with New York, again, passing legislation to allow non-citizens to vote. I still see this argument going on in social media, especially as it is an election year, that this is all about more bodies for voting or turning red cities into blue cities and red regions into blue regions. But this is a more difficult take for me for many reasons, some of which I may not want to put out there, so I'm not going to. But regardless of whether this is another reason for allowing such a grand influx of people who do not value what this country actually was designed to be, if to steal elections is a reason, it's not the reason. But even if it is another reason, if actual results indicate the true reason for advocating open border policies, it does begin to look like there is a segment of our ruling elite who are blindly followed by the masses, who want to feel virtuous and morally superior, who have designs on destroying the very fabric of our country by stressing the system, causing cracks in both of the pillars holding up our civilization. So I actually see open borders, again, not a vast conspiracy necessarily, but the result is the same. The actual result of this open border policy is to destroy the fabric of this country on many, many levels.